Okay, back again. You have outlines back and back in front of the baptismal font, so if you want to follow this. I do these outlines so that you can follow along with what I'm thinking about, and because sometimes I digress a little bit, but at least the outline gets me back to where I want to be. And this morning we're finishing up a two-part series on living in difficult times. If you watch the January 6th special committee, you realize what difficult times we live in today. It's right in front of us. We're living right in the middle of it. At any rate, the way in which I like to begin is to do what I call coming up to speed, which means drawing back on what I did before so that you can kind of pick up on what my pattern of thinking has been. As I say, this particular forum, which is only a two-part series and will be the last one that I'm scheduled to be doing, draws upon the process of Bridges' book called Transitions. And you'll remember that the process of a transition is something has got to end. In personal life, that's pretty obvious generally because someone becomes a teenager, someone is a young adult and decides to get married. They marry somebody other than themselves, and that is always a kind of a transition in understanding. Having children does that. There are a variety of ways in which people have transitions in their own lives. The book has in the first chapter a sort of funny little story, which I'll start off by repeating to you. It talks about how difficult it is to go from one thing to another. The old radio comedian Bob Buenz used to tell a story about eating army food for the first time after 18 years of his mother's deep fat frying. A week of the bland GI fare was not enough to cure something that he had never known in his life, a lifelong case of heartburn. He'd always had heartburn. But rather than feeling relief at this improvement, Buenz said as he rushed into the dispensary, clutching his stomach, yelling, "Doc, Doc, help me, I'm dying. My fire went out." I think it's kind of humorous. And so the soldier there is in the process of moving from having lived in a family with his mother, who was a certain kind of a cook, to being in the Army, where cooking is various. What I've tried to do, and this is not a series devoted to talking about transitions, I've done that before, but what I'm doing is I'm enlarging on the way in which Bridges looks at transitions, generally from a very personal point of view. And sometimes he also did work with corporations in this Santa Clara Valley, because corporations do go through transitions when they are bought or sold or have a new CEO. What I'm doing is I'm doing something I've not seen happen before, and that is I'm enlarging the idea of Bridges' transition to apply to our nation and the world. I call them mega transitions. And I don't know what he would think about that. He died some years ago, so I'll never know. At any rate, what I'm doing is I'm making use of his process to talk about a much, much larger experience of that process in terms of our nation and perhaps the world. And again, if you have a question or a disagreement, just raise your hand. I'll promise to call on you. I welcome all disagreements and questions, and it's all okay to me. Modernity, the modern world, began somewhere back in the 1600s with the rise of rationalization, and progress in the sciences, and the gradually diminution of religion, and that was what was commonly called modernity. Now, most people will read and say, well, we live in the modern world. I don't think we do live in a modern world anymore. We live in what is called a postmodern or after-modern world. And I believe that the modernity began to end, that is to say, the period between starting with 1600s, began to end in the early 1900s with World War I and concluded with World War II. And both of those particular events demonstrated that something had been missed in the whole course of modernity. Modernity was sort of bought lock, stock, and barrel until, especially in World War I, with carnage and destruction, and World War II, the Holocaust, and the introduction of nuclear weapons. All of a sudden, the world began to sense that something has gone beyond the limitations of modernity, and we need a new particular way to begin to think about the world. And so the ending of modernity, I believe, began with World War I and concluded with the ending of World War II. And I have listed 4 different dominant ideologies that were a part of the modern period, which have really come into some level of question. First, has to do with scientific naturalism, which is the rise of the sciences and the application of human reason to sciences. And World War I began to show that science isn't as benign as we thought it was, that what we have learned through our scientific progress can be used for our destruction as well as for our advancement. Enlightenment rationalism. Rationalists believe that there was really nothing beyond human reason, and human reason was what got everything all together and which dominated the ways in which human beings thought about things. And World War I to World War II began to show the limits of human reason. There's some things we simply can't reason our way out of. Therapeutic individualism. That is to say, the dominant rise of individualism, believing that every person is really their own authority, and if you are your own authority, then outside systems of authority don't necessarily apply to you anymore. And if you notice the ways in which, in our present time, individualism is simply rampant. Simply rampant. People disagree about everything, even reality. Great disagreements about what constitutes truth and reality in our time. And finally, economic consumerism. How far will materialism really get you in terms of the meaning of life? And I know people in my own family whose basic ideology is having fun. I frankly think that having fun at that level is really more escapism than engagement in something of meaningful. And so there are 4 dominant ideologies that seem to have failed, beginning with World War I, and at the end of World War II, and if you recall the 60s, remember the 60s? The 60s was the end point, I believe, of modernity, because everything began to go haywire in the 60s. That was Vietnam. You remember Vietnam. And so now we're in a neutral zone. There's been an ending, and now we're in a neutral zone. The neutral zone always follows an ending, and Bridges' way of thinking about transitions, a neutral zone is a time when you're forced to explore what is appropriate next, what ought to come next in terms of your own experience, and that's practically the whole point of these 2 sessions, is that we are now in a neutral zone, and we're having to experiment with a lot of activities and ways of thinking about things, which to me illustrate that we are trying to find out what is really appropriate for our nation and perhaps for our own world. And so what I'm talking about today is elements of the neutral zone. That's where I'm beginning. And if you look at your piece of paper there, you'll find number 2. And there are a whole series of events that have happened which I think illustrate how exploratory and ill-defined the world is at this particular point in time, and especially our own nation. I talked glibly about the ending coming when you realize the rules no longer fit the game, and by game I meant how life is led. how you think about things, what is of value, what are habitual activities that people do. And between World War I and World War II, the game has changed. Changed dramatically, I believe. And as a consequence, yeah, Doug.
Something else disappeared, and that was the attitude that European culture was superior and that Europeans had a right to go into Africa,
Colonialism.
to go into Africa, Asia, and other places and rule over those people. So the age of imperialism, colonialism, that was at the end of World War II, that whole system started falling apart.
It did. And so you have a lot of new nations emerged at that point and are still trying to emerge. And a lot of that has happened in the Mideast, I believe. And of course, I was reading the other day where a lot of the nations in the Middle East, they simply have no alternative to what I would call localized authoritarianism. And so the authority, instead of being in Europe, is now found in the nation, but it's still authoritarianism. And so trying to get a democratic system out of a nation that has been used to being dominated from outside itself, pretty hard thing to do. Takes a lot of trial and error to get that done. And so my thesis is that we're in a neutral zone because the rules of the scientific world, the age of reason, no longer fit the circumstances we're in. We're in different times and are engaged in a number of different explorations of how that has really been different. How life is lived has changed in some very fundamental ways. And if you're old enough, and I'm old enough, to remember what it was like when I was born in 1932, which was the Depression, and the ways in which things have changed from the normal way in which I lived as a boy and as a young adult, and even as a young priest, just doesn't work anymore. I'm amazed at what some clergy think about, or if they do at all. One of the ways in which academically I'm noticing a neutral zone is the ways in which Christianity evolved after the death of Jesus. I have a clergy friend, Jerry Drino, who's a friend of mine, and Jerry sent me a video of a pastor of a church just north of Austin, Texas, and the pastor was giving a forum, rather like mine, about the 200 years after the death of Jesus. And what I was listening to is exactly what I heard in seminary. And I wrote Jerry and I said, Jerry, this sounds very different than the book After Jesus, Before Christianity, because what the religious academic world had done was to translate Christianity as we know it now back to almost like it was after Jesus died. And it didn't happen that way. So there's going to be a real academic discussion between the people who believe that Christianity sort of emerged full-blown after the death of Jesus, and what After Jesus, Before Christianity has to say about the slow evolution of those supper clubs and groups around the Roman Empire. And I think that's a lot more probable than having a new religion emerge automatically after the death of Jesus, because I don't think that was inevitable at all. Jesus didn't have awareness about having a new religion develop, but something happened in the Roman world after his death that caused a gradual evolution of how some people thought about religion. So what I'm doing as I'm talking today, this morning, I'm interested in thinking a little bit about the elements of our neutral zone that were created by how the world has changed. And so the end has occurred, in my way of thinking, and we're now probably since the 60s on into the future. I'll be gone. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I'd like to live on to see how it all works out, but it'll be beyond the ken of any of us here. First of all, I'm on 2B right now, if you're following the outline. I'm thinking about globalization. And globalization really occurred, I think, as a result of probably World War II and the fact that that was fairly much of a global phenomena which brought a lot of people into contact and into action all around the world. And I've got a series of 4 dots right there that talk about how globalization has changed our experience of life. And I have the first of those 3. I realized when I'd done my outline that those were all apocalyptic events. Now, you'll recall the word apocalyptic comes from the word apocalypto, to pull away a veil or to reveal something that is heretofore not been seen, but present, but not necessarily seen. And so when I think about globalization, I think about the Ukraine. When I think about globalization, I think about the pandemic and how difficult it is to get countries around the world organized to fight a common problem. It's very hard to do that. I think about climate change. That's the biggie. That's coming. I just heard, you're aware that we're in a drought this year. I saw on television a newscast that said next year is likely another drought like this year. If that happens, what's going to happen to your lawn? Would you be able to have a lawn? I'm giving a little localized example. I live in a planned unit development, which means there are a series of homes that are set within a common area. And the common area that I bought into in when was that? 1947, right. Lots of grass everywhere. Well, last year I began to realize that we had a drought, so I did a proposal that I sent to the board saying, you know, we're in a drought this year. I understand there's likely to be one next year, and I said this last year. And I said, you really ought to think about taking up the lawns in this association and beginning to plant drought-resistant plants where the lawns used to be. Didn't hear anything back at all. Don't think they read their emails there. I used to be the president of that, but not anymore, so I'm just a voice in the wilderness. First part of this year, suddenly, the board came up with an idea that was exactly the idea I'd proposed. They caught on in the course of the drought of last year to realize that the world that we live in is changing in some fundamental climate ways. And so about half of the association is now in drought-resistant plants. They even changed the budget. I sent them a proposed budget. It's changed that way. And so we're evolving how our association looks by virtue of the fact that we're in climate change, and that's how we're locally experiencing that. So that's a part of the neutral zone. The neutral zone means we're simply not going to have the same kind of world that we're used to living in. And now it's predicted that we'll have a drought next year again. If that happens, it's all going to go. What's left of the association lawns are all going to die. I hope our little drought-resistant plants can make it. A lot of trees are going to die. Maybe you drive around and look and see. All of that is a sign that the rules no longer fit the game. And so globalization, we're realizing this on a global way. National sovereignty. We kind of got used at the end of the ending zone to place a high value on national sovereignty and identity. And suddenly, Putin changes the whole thing. And so that experiment with national sovereignty is in real question now. And voices are saying that if Putin is allowed to take the Ukraine, you really don't know what's going to happen next. And you have 2 countries, Finland and Sweden, who are not a part of NATO, now want to be a part of NATO, because we don't know what Russia's going to do. Nobody can tell. It's at the whim of one particular person in that particular governmental system. So in the sense of globalization, there are a lot of changes that are being explored and experimented with right now that were probably not even thought about before the end of World War II. Last week, who was it? Somebody on the first row, Susie, talked about gender difference, remember? Yeah, she raised the question about gender difference. Now, when I was growing up, you're either a male or a female. That was it. I did have among my circle of friends a young Mexican-American, Bobby Tamez, who seemed somewhat different to me, but I was not familiar with the term homosexual or gender difference, and so I only noticed that he was different than most males that I had known. Looking back on that, I know he must have been a same-sex person, fitted nicely into my group. My group didn't have enough awareness about the effects of gender difference to be able to even think that way about Bobby Tamez. And so increased realization and acceptance of gender difference is one of the real perplexing and in some ways difficult ways in which we are in a neutral zone. One of the things that I noticed occurred in a library where you had a drag queen on Saturday morning was reading children's stories to children. I thought, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I wonder what a drag queen looks like. I don't live in San Francisco, so I really don't know. But I doubt if that would have been recognized when I was growing up and even talked about. And so there are a number of elements in this realization and acceptance of gender difference that I think are causing a part of the division and disruption that's occurring within our nation. And so this drag queen was in a children's library reading, and in walks a bunch of people with a different opinion. And they come in and they break up the reading by this, who I imagine was just doing what she has done for weeks and weeks and weeks, and broke that up because they have a real problem with that difference. That to me is really interesting. And so there's an experience of gender equality we're having, thinking about feminism. I went to seminary at the time when they were all boys, mostly boys, and I sort of assumed that males were the ones who were supposed to be doing what Aaron does. And suddenly there was talk about the ordination of women, and I thought, how can that be? I thought that. And I went to a forum on that subject at Christ Church in Los Altos, and they had an assisting priest there at that time who, a pretty bright guy. I thought he was kind of strange, but he was bright. And he gave a presentation on the ordination of women. And I walked out and I said to Marilyn, I've got to change my opinion. He offered a rationale which was unassailable. I listened to it and I thought, hey, I've got to change because his argument has changed the way in which I was formed as a male priest. And so gender equality has grown to be assumed at this point in time. I think we've worked our way through that. And the Episcopal Church was on the leading edge of all of that. And my young priest friend, I didn't know him very well, at Christ Church had the argument that I walked out and had to change my mind. I didn't know how to do that, so I had to work my way through my own rationale for that. But I also had to change my own mind about it. I think I was here at St. Jude's when that happened. And suddenly we had Mitzi Ackerman who wanted to be ordained. Remember Mitzi Ackerman? Yeah. And we had a bishop, Shannon Mallory, at that point, who would adamantly, his platform in terms of the election were no ordination of women. And here I had somebody in the congregation who demonstrated all the qualities of a priest and a woman. So I had to go to Shannon Mallory and sit down with Shannon with a cup of coffee and say, Shannon, things seem to be changing here. I have this not young anymore, this female, she was a deacon at that point in time, who would like to be ordained to be a priest. And boy, his eyebrows went up like that because he was dealing with a person who he needed to be in a good relationship with. And so I explained to him the rationale that I had heard from Christ Church Los Altos. And I explained that to Bishop Mallory, and he sat there and kind of nodded his head and went to work. And Mitzi Ackerman was the first ordained female priest in the Diocese of El Camino Real. But I took the argument that had changed my mind, and I took it to Shannon Mallory, the then bishop, and gave him the argument, and it changed his mind. And I doubt if he's been the same ever since. So we're in a time of full-blown sense of gender equality when there's very little that can be done in the world that is not open to both male and female. And of course, a lot of young mothers are experiencing the difficulty of trying to act upon gender equality and at the same time be mothers, and that's got to be really hard. Really difficult. I don't know how women really do that. The discovery and exploration of multiple gender identities. There's a spectrum. If I in seminary had somebody tell me that gender identity is on some kind of a spectrum between 0 to 10, first of all, they would not have been teaching that, because that was not a common point of view. It's a common point of view now where you know that men and women the gender is on some kind of a spectrum. Some people are on a 10 and some people are on a 0, but there's a whole lot of numbers in between. And Marilyn and I have a younger daughter who for a long time was pretty masculine. Suddenly she got married. Well, that kind of settled that, but for a time, we wondered: is she really going to be? Is she going to function as a male or a female? And she still operates kind of in a male mode, because she has a responsible leadership role in a local hospital. So she's demonstrating a lot of male gender characteristic as a female, because she's in a leadership role and doing a very good job of it, by the way. And we're proud of her for doing that. And so there's a lot of exploration in terms of gender. And I read a lot, or I hear a lot, about the ways in which there are a lot of there are surgical procedures that are involved with changing a person's sexual, that is to say, sexual functioning from one gender to another. And you probably have met people like that or seen them on television. That's amazing. And that's creating a certain amount of havoc for some people, because there's a lot of people in our nation and perhaps around the world that we don't know anything about, who simply are, that's beyond their ken. They're back to where I was when I was growing up, but they haven't somehow made the change, and so they're locked into a conflicted situation by virtue of the whole male-female thing, and what the roles are for them, what their sexual identities are like. I'm of the conviction that we're having some of the problems we're having in our nation now because we've gone through a lot of significant changes very quickly, and some people have been raised in an environment, a family, or a situation that just has not opened that kind of possibility up, and they're just having a hard time with it. And when I see some of the people reacting against what I would call postmodern gender or sexual activity, reacting strongly against that, I think to myself, they haven't been able to make the change yet. I wonder to what extent the change will become widespread, or whether the change will be interrupted. I don't know yet, but it's a cause of real difficulty in our world right now. A lot of exploration and acceptance of changes in sexual behavior. It used to be that formally people had not experimented with sexual behavior before they were married. You probably remember that time. I'm of the point of view now that you better experiment with that before you get married, because you never can tell about the other person until you've had that kind of close and personal connection with them so you can see what they're really like and not just how they present themselves for marriage. Because most people here are familiar with marriage, you don't really know about another person until you live with them. And once you live with them, then you find out about characteristics which may or may not be helpful for the relationship. And so I'm of the opinion that you better live with somebody before you decide to make a spiritual as well as an economic as well as an existential commitment to spending the rest of your life with a person. You don't do that, you don't know much about them yet. They're only how they present themselves. I'm talking about the ways in which the neutral zone is evident to me in terms of the rules no longer fitting the game having changed, and most all of us trying to figure out what the new rules are. And some have been pretty well established. Some are not well established at all. The rules even vary across the nation. We have different sets of rules on the coasts and the inland areas. A lot of the rules haven't changed yet. How's that going to come down? I don't know. Maybe you know, but I don't. But it's causing an immense amount of stress and confusion in our nation at this particular point in time. I'm down to 2D now. That's one I probably know less about, but I think about a lot. It's called Cyberspace Fundamentally Alters Connection, Relationships, Transfer of Information, and Perceptions of Reality. I'm of the opinion, how do I start this? I believe that one of the fundamental elements of the Christian religion is the uniqueness of incarnation, embodiment. And I'm not at all sure the extent to which you actually begin to recognize the reality of another person on Zoom, or even on television, on the phone, in a text. The way in which you really realize the reality of a person has got to do with standing in front of them. And I believe that's still true, but I think that reality that I have not changed in yet, and I don't think I will, but I might, that reality is long gone for most of the world. Most of the world is functioning now and has had to function as a result of the pandemic, has had to function in cyberspace, virtually. Now, to me, virtual is not real. Virtual is virtually real, but not really real. Now, I don't know where you might be on this. I'd be interested in hearing contrary opinions. But people today, members of St. Jude's, I'm talking to you out there in cyberspace. You're watching what I'm saying. You may be on Zoom. I love you anyway. But what I want to say to you is, I don't believe you're getting the full reality of this presentation by watching it on Zoom. You're getting a virtual experience of that, but you're not getting an incarnated. Incarnate means enfleshed. Years ago when I was younger, I did an Easter sermon called Where's the Beef? Takes a while, doesn't it? Where's the beef? You get it. He gets it. We're in good shape here. If Aaron can get that particular Easter sermon, Aaron will be good for you for a good time. Good period. Where's the beef? And of course, that sermon was about where is the reality of Jesus of Nazareth to be found now after he is no longer located in the tomb. And that is to say, where is his incarnated, embodied, enfleshed reality to be found? And I think that cyberspace fundamentally alters the way in which we appear to one another. I think it's probably a good thing in a lot of ways. I belong to a group that meets on Wednesdays to take a look at Scripture for the coming Sunday, and we used to meet together in person, but no longer we meet on Zoom. Well, I think that there's less experience, depth experience of each other in that group, but we have people who live in Oregon, and we have people that live around the United States, and the same program is done again on Thursday, and that program has people all over the United States in it. And I value it, but I don't get the same kind of experience of it that I got when we used to meet at St. Francis in Willow Glen, when we all sat around the table together, because you could look at the other person and you could see you could look at their eyes, you could look at their posture, and there was something that came through their incarnated presence that is missed now in terms of Zoom and cyber communication. I think also, if you're one of the issues we have right now, I see. Okay, Doug, go to it. Here you are.
Is this thing still on?
Yes, it is.
Okay. One thing I experience is a lot of my neighbors work on the sidewalk. They're walking down the sidewalk, talking to themselves, it appears. And I'll say, "Hi, how are you doing today?" "Oh, I can't talk. I'm in a meeting." So we have public space being opted for private business, and it's very confusing to me. Because I used to say hi to everybody. Now I have to be careful.
You want to be sure they're not in a virtual meeting. Okay, good. One of the issues we have right now in cyberspace has got to do with social media. And one part of that's got to do is Elon Musk really going to buy Twitter? And if Elon Musk buys Twitter, is he going to open up the allowable connections on Twitter that Twitter has shut down because they're concerned with the kind of things that get communicated over cyberspace? And a lot of the issues that we face now in terms of reality have got to do with the way in which in cyberspace communications are happening that have very, very different points of view about what I think is real, and communicate in ways that organize groups into activities that I believe are destructive. And how that gets monitored and how that gets, what the effect of that is going to be, we're already experiencing it. And that is another aspect of the neutral zone that we're really in a deep exploration about in terms of our own nation. And it's a pretty serious kind of a question, too. And I go to my second page, which is, again, D.E. Yeah. Current experience of polarization and violence. Well, what happened on January the 6th, and by the way, that's the Feast of the Epiphany. Did you know that? Don't miss that. That was an epiphany. And I was in this group that I meet with. It was on a Wednesday. And suddenly I was hearing on the radio or someplace on television, hearing about what was happening. And so I immediately lurched into this Zoom conversation about Scripture, and say, you know, I've just heard from cyberspace again that our nation capital has been invaded by a group of people who want to take over the government. That was a shock wave that went through that group like you have never heard before. And so a lot of what is going on right now that we take to be difficult, understandably difficult, is occurring because of what is happening in cyberspace. And some groups are willing to monitor that fairly closely. Other groups are making money about not monitoring it at all. And it's a struggle to how to respond to the experience of just being in the neutral zone. How do you respond to all? And everybody in this room and everybody on Zoom, out there in Zoom land, is all engaged in these issues. And my thesis is that these issues are existing because we are no longer in we're no longer in the period of time 1600 to 1919. That has ended, and nobody knows how it's going to come down. Nobody can tell exactly how it's going to happen. I believe that a lot of what is going on in our nation in terms of the kinds of conflicts we're in is because there's too much change for many people to absorb. And that doesn't mean I'm against what changes are being made. I'm concerned about the fact that they're being made. And how do you monitor that? Because you can't stop the kinds of reactions that are necessary to have to the kind of changed circumstances that we're all experiencing. And everybody in this room is in that. We're all in that together. And again, this week I'm thinking especially about the January 6th special committee and their hearings. And of course, we're watching that virtually. And that was an apocalyptic event. That was a very revealing and disclosing national event that we all watched, and almost everybody watched it. And even watching this special committee at this point in time, we're seeing new dimensions of that. The vice president could have been hung. The people who would have done that were 40 feet from him. Think what would have happened if that had happened. And now all that was occurring because of this collision between people that are engaged in the changes in a neutral zone or engaged in those changes with people who either don't know anything about a neutral zone, never thought about transitions, can't spell transitions, and refuse to go along. And I really, it's a national problem. I often wonder how on earth our president is handling this. Well, I'm down to number F now. Religion has changed also. And the time which I offered this particular forum, which was in between Aaron and Wilma, thank you. Between Aaron and Wilma, and Kathy was the one that, well, I think you organized that. Yeah, I think you did. You were the senior warden then. And so at that particular occasion was my first time on virtually on Zoom from my own office on Dean Court up in Cupertino up there. And I talked a lot about one of the ways in which the change is occurring is in terms of religion. And last week I quoted to you a poem by William Butler Yeats in 1919. And it was a poem which talked about, he was a prophetic figure. He talked about what the effect of World War I was going to be on the world in terms of religion. And the phrases that I remember from that were, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. We're the falcons. The falconer is the larger reality that we use the word God to refer to. God is a word that refers to that reality. In fact, I'm not sure it's a reality. It's what causes reality, I believe. Anyway, you're hearing my theology now. And in order to talk about that, I talked about the difference between two popes, Pope Benedict XVI and Francis I. And those are two popes. There was a movie made of them called The Two Popes. You may have seen that movie. And it was a movie which depicted conversations between Benedict XVI, in which he had retired. Never heard of a pope retiring before, but he retired, and that in itself was a change. And Francis I, who is not from Italy, but from Argentina, who becomes the pope, and the struggle between the two of them to come to terms with how they understood their religion. And the movie was very, very graphic in depicting the ways in which Benedict XVI was probably somewhere out of the modern world, and Francis, with one foot in the modern world and one foot in the postmodern world, and trying to hold together the diversity of the Roman Catholic communion when the rules no longer fit the game. And you can see an element of that which is happening locally now in terms of the Archbishop of San Francisco denying communion to the Speaker of the House, when the Archbishop of Washington puts her in communion. What are they going to do? How are they going to get along as two archbishops when their view of the change of the rules because the change of the rules because the game has changed, how are they going to get along in a conference? How on earth is the Roman Catholic Communion going to work with the difference between people who agree with Francis I and agree with Benedict XVI? So in terms of what I was trying to do before you came, Aaron, it's really different. Then you have what I call the rise of the nuns, not religious nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. And if people go out and do interviews with people about religion, you're getting a higher and higher proportion of people who are not irreligious, they're not religious, they don't belong to anything, they probably still have some sense about the reality of transcendence, which was largely lost in the modern world in favor of reason, human reason vis-a-vis faith. Secular culture is a culture that's been flattened, doesn't have any depth to it. It's a flat culture, secular. And the rise of the nuns is marching on. So what is going to happen to religious institutions such as the one that we all belong to? And Aaron, you and I represent that. I hate to tell you, but that's it. We're marked with that. I am marked with the mark of a priest, which is in real question at this point. What do I represent? What can be expected of an institution like this one? And the people who kind of technically have authority for the tradition, and the tradition is in question. It's in motion. And so that puts a real, I'm sure you feel that. I've felt it for years now. I felt it when I was here at St. Jude's. And marching between people whose sense of religion had been gone or flattened, secularized, and people who still wanted to believe what they had always believed. Last night I got a telephone call, yesterday afternoon I got a telephone call from a nurse that is tending a woman who is 101 who's dying. And so she calls me on the phone. I know this woman, Marilyn and I knew this woman for years and years, called me on the phone and said, Sally's dying. And she's lying here in bed, and I'm trying to comfort her, and I know that you knew her. Can you do something to help her out as she dies? And I was sitting there watching the news. Yeah. Well, I didn't do it. What I should have done is I should have got the prayer book and read some Psalms. But what I did was I invented a prayer that I believe, knowing Sally, would fit her level of religious conviction, which is different than mine. And in doing that, I realized, Sally hasn't been in church in years. So what can I do for her on a speakerphone as she lies there at 101, dying and excreting her last fluids? That's a challenge. That's a challenge, Aaron. He knows it already. That's a real challenge. So I had to, in my own thinking, I had to come up with a spiritually sincere offering that was somewhere different between what I would normally think in my own prayer life and what I thought this person who was not even probably hearing might think or find to be of use as she dies. She's still here. She didn't die. She refuses to let go. And a lot of my prayer had to do with she loved her husband. Marilyn and I knew both of them. And I talked to her about something I'm not so sure I'm convicted about, but I talked about the fact that she's standing in front of a door. On the other side of the door was her husband, Warren. And Warren is waiting to greet you into a larger life. And that's the way I translated what I think into what I think she thinks. And so there was not a standard way for me to think about where she was in an existential crisis in her own life. I'm still looking at F, religion. The falconer cannot hear the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. You're living in a world where the center doesn't hold. Doesn't hold. If the center doesn't hold, there's no reality large enough to encompass all of global reality. So if the center doesn't hold, what holds? And that's why we have a lot of authoritarians in countries around the world, because they're trying to find a center that will hold. And of course, that's bogus. We have found that out in our own experience. And so there's a suspicion of tradition. When you think about preaching, I still preach occasionally. I think about what part of the tradition can I articulate, and this is not at St. Jude's, it's around and about, and I try and look at a congregation of what I know, and I think, where are they in terms of the tradition that they're operating in? Are they still in a tradition that I originated in? Or are they in a tradition that I am currently working on right now? Or do they have no tradition at all? How do you preach to people when you don't know where on earth they are? When I left St. Jude's to go to a congregation in Spokane, Washington, I shifted from one culture to another with a Sunday in between. And I was advised very shortly that this is where you are. You're not in California anymore. You're in Spokane, Washington. Oh, I'm in Spokane, Washington. Where are they in Spokane, Washington in terms of the tradition that I'm supposed to articulate? Institutions. I'm about to say more about institutions, but institutions are entities which are designed to carry an important reality from one generation to another. They have the ability to carry something from one generation to another. Institutions are failing all around us. Authority. Who has the authority now? The individual has the authority. That's who's got it. And I think that works pretty well in the Episcopal Church, because the authority in the Episcopal Church is fairly well distributed. But there are some churches for which the authority lies in the pastor. And if the pastor says something, then that's what people are going to believe. How do you work between those two realities in religion? Okay, I'm almost at the end here. And this is where I think this rubber meets the road. It's the role of church and Christians to experience the neutral zone. And here's where I think we are in the neutral zone. On a corporate level, the church is moving from an institution to a movement. The Jesus movement, Michael Curry, our presiding bishop, I think he is right on. He is dead on. Boy, is he ever. Now, I don't think he understands the difference between an institution and a movement in terms of actual functioning, but he knows intuitively, because I've spoken about this in a meeting when he was there. I asked him, how are the rules in a movement different than an institution? And he looked baffled. And I thought, okay, but that's all right. You got the point. The point is that if we think we can operate the church, St. Jude's, our diocese, can operate as it always has as an institution, you won't go very far. I noticed for Pentecost, people tossing a balloon back and forth over their heads. I thought to myself, that would have never happened when I was here. Right. But the institution and the worshipful part of the St. Jude's institution has moved from being fairly staid and trying to introduce a new prayer book. After my predecessor had thrown the new prayer book out, I came on board and had to reinstitute it again. And now there's no formal prayer book. There are lots and lots of options and alternatives which are open, and you know a lot more about that than I do. I don't follow that, but I think it's a good thing. That's part about being a movement. The same book does not apply equally to every Episcopal congregation, in our national church. When you arrive at a place, you got to kind of find out where they are legitimately, and then try and find a worship form that will fit the reality of the place where you find yourself. And I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. If I'd been in your place, when I went to Spokane, I had to shape up in a big hurry. Had to use a big pulpit, prayer book only. On an individual level, the role of Christians, I think, and this is the end of my little excursion here. This is 3B. Develop a personal grounding through a sense of spiritual understanding, identity, and purpose, and be willing to share and act upon that. So I think that as individual Christians, if you really want to make a difference in terms of the place of religion in your environment, you want to begin to think more deeply than you ever have thought before. Marilyn, can I use what we talked about yesterday? Probably can't. Yeah. Well, we have friends who go to Christ Church Los Altos, where I've spent some time, and the bishop is handing out in the Diocese of California. That's the diocese up that way. The other one, the old diocese. We're the new one. The bishop up there is asking to be developed in certain congregations in his diocese a program that he has picked up from somewhere, and I don't know where, with a whole series of questions which are very pregnant questions. Marilyn got a copy of this, and I'm not going to repeat the questions, but a whole series of questions to be asked within the congregation that talk about where people are personally and where they are in terms of what they agree with and don't agree with. And that is an effort on an individual level to get people beyond just the idle chit-chat of coffee hour into talking and thinking a little more deeply. I'll tell you, it's very hard to get a religious discussion with people. Even for priests, people avoid priests who do that because they're not in the habit of thinking about that because they don't know how to think about it. They've either forgotten the catechism, or the catechism doesn't work for them, or it doesn't apply at all anymore. So people really don't know. I think on a larger group, don't really know anymore about how to make personal sense out of religion and what the meaning of it is for them. And I think the role of Christians in the neutral zone is to begin to come to terms with actually being able to have a conversation. If you don't believe something, say you don't believe it. It's all right. But I think that, I hope that Aaron will be in a position, and I think he has a mentality to be able to hear a whole lot of variety, but I think part of your job is to begin to probe that variety. Because until a person has begun to learn to articulate something about their convictions, religious convictions, that makes sense to them, real sense to them, then they're not going to say anything to anybody, and the world is going to go by them. Well, that is the neutral zone that we're in right now, and we're in the neutral zone because the rules no longer fit the game. The game has changed, and we're trying to figure out what the rules are, and meanwhile there's a lot of perplexion and strident disagreement that's going on publicly. And if you don't understand the disagreement, just look in on the January 6th special committee meetings, public meetings next week. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for having me, Mr. Rector. I hope I haven't disturbed your...
You disturbed us in all the right ways, John, which is exactly what I asked you to do. Thank you very much, John. Before we finish up, just a couple notes. Lots of gratitude, John, for all the work you did. I know you put in a lot of work to bring both of these forums to us, and I'm very grateful. So thank you. Any questions for John, whether you're the 10 folks who are joining us online or anybody here in the room? Any questions or comments for John while he's still here with us? Well, feel free to chat with him after. A couple notes. Building on much of what John has been saying, John has been using this metaphor of how the rules of the game have changed, how the game has changed. This week in our vestry meeting and in our ministry leaders meeting, we'll be talking, using a different metaphor, about how the maps have changed. The maps we have for how we do church, for how we function in our world, those maps no longer work the way the maps used to work. You can imagine going to a place and you had a map, and now you're in the same place, but the map doesn't match the place anymore. The maps don't work anymore. A different metaphor for the same kind of change. If you want to see how that looks in our larger church world, look no further than this next month. Just a few weeks from now, our Episcopal General Convention will happen. It is happening in Baltimore, but it's happening in a very different way than general conventions have happened in the past. Part of that is largely because of COVID, so that's changing how that gathering functions. Not only that, we are delayed a year. We were supposed to have general convention last year, but now we're having it this year. So we'll have it again in 2 years, I think, to get back on that 3-year cycle that we always do. And so in 2 years, we'll be electing a new presiding bishop. Who will that new presiding bishop be? Our last presiding bishop, Michael Curry, that John talked about, was the first African-American presiding bishop that we've had. Before that, we had the first woman who was our presiding bishop. So neither of those things would have happened in the Episcopal Church that existed 50 years ago. So talk about a sea change, about maps no longer applying, about rules of the game changing. That's happening there. Right after General Convention, our bishop and all the other bishops of our church will head across the pond to Lambeth, to the Lambeth Conference. The Lambeth Conferences were started in the late 1800s, a gathering of all Anglican bishops from all over the world. The reason those conferences started was an outcry from bishops in international places, not in the UK, saying, how do we do this thing? What is the Anglican communion anyway? And now they're gathering, and they're still having those conversations now around sexuality, and in the past around gender. Presiding Bishop Catherine Jefferts Schori, first female presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church here in the U.S., she was not allowed to be seated when she went to the Lambeth Conference years ago because she was a woman. So dramatic changes happening in the life of our church, both in the U.S. and internationally. And then, of course, this July will also be the general, not convention, they call it a conference, the General Conference of the United Methodist Church. At one time, the largest Protestant church in the United States. It's not anymore. The Southern Baptists held that for a while, although they're shrinking now too. And very likely this summer, the United Methodist Church will fracture in some meaningful way over and around the issue of sexuality. So profound changes happening in the life of our religious institutions. And that's happening at that larger corporate level. Of course, we all know and feel those changes happening on a ground level, St. Jude's parish level as well. Those changes are happening here as well. So all stuff for us to continue to be prayerful of and in discussion about, as John led us so well in thinking about. And like I said, we're going to be talking about just those things in our vestry meeting this week and in our ministry leaders meeting as well, how to navigate through those changes as a parish. Now, last thing I want to tell you, no forum next week, which is the 26th of June. The next week is July 3rd, so 2 weeks from now. On that day, we will have a forum, and that will be a forum from some of our diocesan delegates to General Convention. They will come, is it one or two? It's one person, Nancy Cohen from All Saints Palo Alto. She will be here with us to talk about the things that will be before the General Convention that she will be attending in Baltimore. So she'll talk with us about the upcoming General Convention. And then 2 weeks later, July 17th, we'll have another forum, but this time with Tim Gee who's from St. Andrews, right? Tim Gee, who's also a diocesan delegate. So after General Convention, he'll come and say, well, you heard about what was going to happen. Now let me tell you about what actually happened. So we'll get a before and after on General Convention, which will be, which I'm really looking forward to. And of course, we will share through our various communications means ways to follow the work of General Convention from home. Lots of it will be streamed, lots of it will be online. So I just want you to be in the loop about all that. So no forum next week, and then forum on the 3rd, forum on the 17th. So that's it for now. Thank you again, John, very much. Let's give John a round of applause. And we've got about 15 minutes before we get ready for worship, so thanks for being here. Have a great rest of your day.
You said that it used to be the Baptists and the Methodists, and no longer. Who is the biggest Protestant denomination now?